Good evening, everyone. My name is Asad Lalji on behalf of Avid Learning. Welcome to a very special evening. It's interesting to see how maps have evolved from their simple beginnings as a useful tool for typographical depictions and navigations to intricate visual aids that not only direct us, but stimulate our curiosity. Mumbai's rich history can be revisited through maps. They give us a glimpse of the city's development, evolution, change over time, looking at local communities, infrastructures, and cultural identities. Maps have been the catalyst and a source of inspiration for many visual artists over the years. Today, they mix technology, design, cartography to provide powerful visual representations that go beyond the simple use. We can all agree that some of them are intricate and beautiful works of art by themselves. This brings me to our evening's captivating session. Story of Mumbai through maps, putting art into cartography. It's brought to you part of an ongoing exhibition at the Asiatic Society, Map, the Surveys That Left Behind a Legacy, curated by Past Perfect Heritage Management. At Avid Learning, we strongly believe in collaboration and are proud to present this evening in partnership with the Tata Group, Asiatic Society of Mumbai, the Rotary Club of Bombay, and Past Perfect. A very special thank you to Mrs. Balaporia, Shanaz, and Arun for always having us here and always being so welcome. I know some of them are not here today. So without further ado, please join your hands in welcoming our panel of experts. Typographer, Design Director, Bombay Duck Design, Zeenat Kulubur. Founder, Kahani Design Works, Publisher, Story City, Ruchitara Maddock. Film producer, founder of India Visual Art Archive, Mrinal Kapadia. And our moderator for the evening, Curator, Collections, Education and Outreach, Dr. Bhadaji Art Museum, Ruta Wagmare Baptista. Our expert contemporary artists and cultural practitioners will showcase how they use maps to create meaningful and impactful visual representations of the world around us. Look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you, and over to you, Ruta.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's so heartening to see so many people in the audience on a Tuesday evening. It is an absolute honor to be invited to the Asiatic Society and this hallowed Darbar Hall to moderate this panel discussion. And for that, I would specifically like to thank the Asiatic Society, Rotary Club of Bombay, Avid Learning, and Past Perfect. As many of you here may know, the Bhadaji Museum possesses a collection of rare maps of Mumbai, as well as other regions of the Indian subcontinent. I have studied, wondered, and imagined with these maps because I've had the privilege of working at the museum for the last decade now. We have hosted numerous workshops, outreach sessions, discussing these maps and doing art sessions also inspired by cartography. The collection now also has grown to include contemporary maps commissioned specially by the museum. In the early days of research of these maps over the last few years, and some of my former and current colleagues are in the audience, they'll remember this, that we have done so many experiments in how to read these maps. One such fun experiment was overlaying the Google map on an 18th century Peshwa map that is in the museum collection to see the way the roads, are they accurate, the representation of rivers, is it accurate? And I love this map especially because it has some boats and fishes drawn onto it to indicate the current flow. We also have a 19th century Phillips planisphere, which is a star map, a map to look at the constellations and stars. So there are so many ways we have been engaging with these maps. My own personal love for maps began in the early 2000s when my father, who's sitting in the audience, bought this set of 8 CD-ROMs that National Geographic used to have and sell. And these maps were wonderful because they showed not only the different maps of across different continents, but also like a historical timeline of events. So I guess my love for maps begins there. And though I'm directionally challenged myself personally, maps of all kinds can do so much more, tell so much more than just direct us from point A to point B. So today we are going to look at 3 distinct dimensions of cartography looking at the word art hidden within the name cartography, which is A for aesthetics, R for representation, and T for technique. It is my pleasure to ask my friends and colleagues here to talk a few minutes and present their work. We'll begin with Mrinal Kapadia, who is the founder of Visual Art Archive. And why don't you spend a few minutes?
Hi all, so I'm Mrinal Kapadia. I began my journey to this space, at least, just collecting a few of these maps. Over the years, I really had no idea until COVID hit as to what it is that I'm collecting. You know, it again, for me, a lot of this originated as Bombay being a place and time, and you know how Bombay evolves, and I can see it evolve over the decades and centuries in these maps, and it's only during COVID that I started realizing what I was collecting, and I started researching them. So this is just some of the views here. Of course, you know, you can see the map on the right, but the collections also, it consists of watercolors, prints, and photographs. So I think we'll talk more in detail. I've been told to keep this short, so we'll talk a little more in detail as the function, as the event itself progresses. What I also did is, apart from you know, looking into what I have in my collection, it automatically, you know, as your curiosity kind of just drives you, it led me a little more into the history of Bombay as a whole. So I started looking into historical documentation which exists in institutes abroad, especially in the UK and Portugal, because of their tryst with Bombay specifically over the last many centuries. So again, there's a Portuguese document on the left in Evora, in the city of Evora in Portugal, that has the earliest ever description of Bombay, because Bombay was a non-entity even in the early 1600s, mid-1600s. The document on the right, I had the privilege of photographing at the British Library. It's the transfer of the Bombay Islands from the British Crown to the British East India Company in 1668. So again, just visual representation of the research work that I've done during COVID. Thanks. And again, what it eventually led to is a lot of Zoom talks that I do and try and engage with this new research base that I had. It's again, Zoom talks during COVID and post-COVID is a whole bunch of events, many of them related to maps also. And again, I think it's just growing from here. And yeah, that's how I'm taking it forward. And I'll just come to the last slide. What it is that I'm currently working on is, you know, I've started again. Once some of the mainstream, at least I feel as a collector and a researcher, once you know, you've covered some of the mainstream, it gets into obscure bits. So there's some archives that I recently acquired. One's related to the Messina family of Messina Hospital, the bit on the right. So it's again, you know, the one on the left is related to private that was with the Bombay garrison for many decades. And it's again their diaries and their wherewithals and, you know, looking into what life was. It's like a snapshot of life in those decades or those years. So that's what I'm currently working on, and happy to talk to anyone and everyone after the event about any of this work. So thanks.
Thanks, Mrinal. I would now invite Ruchita to introduce her work and practice.
Hi, I'm Ruchita. I am the founder director of Kahani Design Works, which is a communication design studio. We're about 11 years old, and we specialize in working with the arts and culture sector in Mumbai. Now, while our day-to-day work has been publication design, exhibition design, communications for major museums and institutions, galleries and artists in Mumbai and across the country. We have, my husband and I, who also runs a practice with me, we have had a passion for maps. And somewhere this passion comes from our time as students in London, where we were both doing our masters. We found that the city of London and its history is so accessible through books and guides and maps at every street corner. You can navigate the city on your own and learn about all these different layers of the city on your own. When we moved back to Mumbai in 2012, we found that there was absolutely nothing of the sort about Mumbai city. There were a couple of books, very standard books on bookshelves, but nothing that would encourage a visitor or a tourist to pick up a map and actually learn to navigate the city themselves. So the very first publication we did which we released in 2014, was City by the Sea, which is more of a story map on the city, where we explored the relationship of Mumbai city with the sea. We kind of forget that we're an island sometimes, and we're now busy blocking up all access points to the ocean. Back in 2012, this seemed like a very urgent thing to do, to establish that relationship with this open space and this history that we have, which connects us to the rest of the world. So, starting with City by the Sea, we've made about 7 or 8 maps under the Story City imprint, which is our own publishing imprint, which we self-publish at Kahani. The next map that we did was Building Bombay, which looks at the architecture that came up around the time when Bombay transitioned from being a small garrison town to becoming a city, to becoming Urbs Pre-Mine Indus, which is the first city of the East. And the architecture, the 25 stories that are covered within the map, the 25 sites that are covered, followed that story across the span of 2 centuries. And to our most recent map, which is Deco by the Bay, which is a walking-friendly guide to 4 Deco neighborhoods within the city. We'd already published around Art Deco in the city when the site around Oval Maidan received World Heritage status. So we said, let's make a map to accompany this, something that's easy accessible, but is also a really great souvenir of Art Deco to take back home when you visit the city of Mumbai. So these are 3 of the many maps that we've done. We've worked with Intact, we've worked with Kochi Biennale, we've worked with the museum, the Balaji Lal Museum. We've worked with many institutions to actually map the city in different ways. We used to work with the publishers of the Mumbai Art Map that the old-time art enthusiasts in the city will remember. So mapping is now a very core part of our practice as communication designers in the city, and it's a very core practice as information designers, and we write around this idea of spatially mapping and understanding the city as well.
Thank you, Ruchita. Zeenat Kulavur would like to now present her practice.
Yeah, my name is Zeenat Kulavur. I'm a typographer, and I run a small boutique design studio called Bombay Duck Designs. As per our work, we do a lot of different kinds of graphic design, which span from murals to book design to maps now, and branding and stuff. I'm here because, as all of you, I love maps. And although I've done a lot of other commercial maps, like maps for, music festivals and, different properties around Bombay, this is one special map that I want to talk to you about today, is a map of Baikala. It's called Because Baikala. It's quite an extensive project. In comparison to Ruchita, it's just one map. But I'll dive deep into it as the talk progresses. The next few projects, this is a mural that we did for Bombay Canteen. Here I would like to also look at how maps form an integral part of our practice. Maybe they're not upfront like a map in your hand, but they form part of our other work, which is like this mural. It has an engraved map of Bombay on the wall behind these tiles. It's an olden map where Bombay was 7 different islands. So that map here is used to put together the mural and give context to the entire exercise. The next is a book called Harsham Shaheen Bagh. There was a map in this book as well. It was a map of the artist Pratna Singh, for whom we created this book. She created a map, a scribbled map from her house to reaching Shaheen Bagh, which was like an everyday exercise for her. So that's other ways in how maps, interfere in my work and be part of it. So yeah, I think we can begin.
Thank you, Zeenat. Okay, so when we begin, I would like to begin, in fact, with addressing the topic you all just spoke about, which is what have been your inspirations to get into, to study maps, to create maps, and use maps as a storytelling device. We can begin with you, Mrinal, and then progress down.
Sure. So for me, again, this was quite random thing that I stumbled into in the beginning, and then it grew and grew from there. But the base of the inspiration for me in this space was Bombay and nostalgia for Bombay being a place and time. Again, just growing up with certain types of stories in a certain environment, and, Bombay being very special and different from, most places that I would encounter over the years. And I lived abroad for some time and such. And, so again, just trying to make sense of where all this comes from, is where that whole journey began. At least with the mapping side, as you see, again, maps have had different functions over the many decades and centuries. And, as you see something evolve through the visual of a map, for me, it helped. At least I can say I tried to make sense of answering the bigger question that I had at the back of my mind as I looked through these images. And yeah, so that's the real inspiration for me, nostalgia.
Thanks. And same question to both of you. And also if you want to mention about any particular projects that kind of inspired you down this path.
So the first map I ever made, I was 8 years old. Our school very bravely took us for a walk around Mahim. I went to Bombay Scottish School, and we went for a walk around Mahim as third standard kids. And when we got back to class, we were told, okay, make a map of everything that you saw. And firstly, the idea of making a map was this very new exercise. But, what did you see? Okay, we saw the Mahim Dargah. Okay, so try and draw the Dargah. We saw police stations. So, we made a little policeman standing there. We saw the church. So we tried to draw a church. And that became a form of memorizing, but also memorializing something that had happened. And for me, that instinct remains, that draw of kind of freezing that memory, that spatial geographic memory of a place. If I could walk back that route, it would probably be a different route today, but I would have sense of how I had drawn it. And I think as a designer, we learn the practice of drawing to remember, drawing to observe, drawing to record, drawing to communicate. And I think the mapping exercise, as an exhibition designer, I'm constantly making sense of spatial journeys, whether in a building or a room or through a series of spaces. So for me, it's very much a part of my practice of sense making first, and then recording, and then communicating. So that's where my impulse comes from. That's the core impulse. But also like I'm a Bombay girl, I said, "Mere Bombay ka map kyun nahi hai?" So that really is the driving force behind, the practice of continuing to make and sometimes foolishly self-publish maps again and again and again and again. So that's where it comes from.
Maps for me, definitely I didn't make a map when I was 8. It actually happened when I started running a design studio, and because we work with a lot of tactile materials, paper, pens, inks, this, that, we have an office manager in studio, and he was new, and every time I had to tell him to get me something, I had to, send him to this right spot, because he didn't have Google Maps back then. And it was an everyday exercise. It started like that. And eventually I started having fun. I started using colorful markers to mark things for him. And that's how it all began. But now this map has a whole different story. This map, I mean the Baikala map. Similarly, when, a lot of people used to visit our studio in Muscat. We were based in Muscat. We lived and worked there almost for 12 years. During that time, we had a lot of visitors in studio, and the exercise just came handy. And I would make these maps on pieces of paper and tell them, now that you're in studio, go here and eat, or go look at this. It's quite close by. This we did for almost like 8-9 years of being in that space, making maps for people. Then we decided why not formalize it. We know quite a bit of the locality, and I think it would be a great thing to put things together. Little did I know that there was a lot more that I did not know about the space while researching for the map. But yeah, that was a long process and a great journey. Do you want me to talk about it now? Or?
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. So obviously maps tell us a lot about the evolution of cities, and for if you have had a chance to look at these amazing rare maps on display right now, you would see the real-time change happening. That brings me to a point where if you are aware of the older maps, starting from 1600s, for example, there is a sketch by Davis, which used to be in the old Mumbai Gazetteers, it's almost, when I first saw it, I felt it was a child's drawing. Then, of course, I read more about the history of it, and I realized the perspective was looking through to the island of Bombay through a ship as he was coming into the harbor. So early maps actually began as an exercise in just documenting the land, not necessarily being accurate in the exercise of map making as we understand it today, and as you see in the trigonometrical surveys and so on and so forth displayed in these maps. Would you like to touch upon the differences between how the Portuguese and the early incoming people of the East India Company or the merchants of the East India Company were surveying land rather than actually making maps, for example?
Sure. So I think this is extremely well put. I think literally, if you see something like the sketch that she's talking about, and I think there's a facsimile at the Bhaudajilad Museum on the first floor in their permanent exhibit. But so basically, the more decorative versions of such charts were called seafarers' charts in the 16th century. 16th century, again, from a European point of view, it was just the Portuguese that had, the control of the eastern trade route, and it was almost domination at the time. And so, the thing is, at the time, the conception of the Portuguese in terms of how they viewed a coastline was very different from what we think of it as now. So today, we see maps and we see lines which clearly delineate the land versus the water. But in the times of the Portuguese seafarers' charts in the 16th century especially, and even the early 16th century, even the early 17th century, you see the coastline of the western coast of India, for example, since we're on the subject of Bombay, the land and sea would flow in and out of each other. So, at the time we see that everything is from the perspective of the sea, and land and sea would float in and out of each other depending on the time of the day, which is the tide, the season of the year, which is, whether it's monsoon or not. So, inundations were very common, and, you'd constantly have, land and sea interact very, very differently from what we see today. So, when you see those charts of Bombay, we start seeing charts of Bombay from the 17th century, the mid-17th century, and that's around the time where the British had already come in to some extent. They had a presence, and the British conception of beginning to chart out land at the time was to, first of all, delineate the land versus the water, and also to have coordinates, which is latitudes and longitudes, which started coming up around that time. So, you see a very formal system that's slowly forming, and that's why most maps of Bombay today, since we're on the subject, and again, these were art pieces in their time. The very, very early maps of the western coast of India, where there's no Bombay mention, are, you see the shape of the coastline constantly change. It's not linear, but once the British come in and begin to establish their system, there's a very, very structured shape of the lines that delineate the maps. So, again, it's as per coordinates. When the conception of mapping goes from the sea to land. So first, it's coming in from the sea. It's from the perspective of the sea, and later the whole concept of mapping becomes from the perspective of the land.
Absolutely. And while we are on the subject of historical maps, you both have worked in very different historical areas. You have created maps for different historical areas of Mumbai. Is there any particular map of these areas which were existing from the previous centuries that particularly spoke to you?
we worked on Mazgaon Baikala, and I don't think I've seen any maps that details out this one small locality as much as we've tried to. There definitely is, Mazgaon being one of the 7 islands, there's always been that big name there. But I've never seen a map that is much more detailed of this one area.
I think our inspiration has always been contemporary mapping and contemporary illustration, because with access to open source maps or even Google Maps, a great many artists, designers and illustrators bring their own personal point of view and own personal journeys to the practice of map making. And so in a sense for us, it is always, that's always a great visual starting point. What would I like to see in a map like this? I know that we have this, for example, Art Deco architecture in Mumbai, but what would I like to tell someone when they come and visit the city? So we take a very editorial approach to the maps that we take. We don't intend for them to be definitive in any way. They are from particular personal points of view. And while there are a great many historical maps, they do intend to be objective. Whereas our maps kind of straddle that boundary between being objective and being subjective.
So there are many tourist guide maps that I'm sure everybody who loves traveling loves to also collect through their journeys. And this is something that always struck me, and I found this beautiful series of guidebooks and maps at an exhibition a few years back at Artisans that Robert Stephens had hosted of the old tourist guides of Mumbai. And they had some hilarious advice, some sage advice. And it always struck me how interesting it is that in this day of Google Maps, we still sometimes rely on these, at least I know I do, rely on the hard maps that take you from point A to point B, or just show you a city in a different way. So that's one thing I wanted to ask both of you, that what goes into creating this kind of a visual guide of a neighborhood? How do you approach your specific maps? There are different themes you both have worked on. If there's anything you would like to touch upon over there.
So, you were talking about the process, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll first start with a story. I was in Amsterdam in 2017. There were lots of options for restaurants, lots of options for different museums, shows, etc., etc. There was so much that it was overwhelming. And after a point, like after one day of going around all of these things that I saw on Google Maps, I was just like, you know what, I'll just enter a shop, I'll do some shopping, and then I'll head. So when I entered this shop was a design shop. They had really good, art materials made out of brass, ball pens and pens, and it was very fascinating. And I got to talking to these people. And then this woman pulls out a map, and she said that, you know what, there is this map that we made. It's about places that we like, we prefer, and we would like, our friends and families to visit. And she gave me this map. Trust me, the next 3 days were amazing. The kind of food I got to eat, the kind of things I saw, the stores, the museums, everything was amazing. After that experience, I thought that, if a local of a place makes a map, it has a whole different touch to it. It has a different story about it. You'll Google things, you'll find them on Google Maps, but it's not the same. While we were making maps of Baikala, that was one thing that stayed with me. While researching, we made sure that, because we were there for almost 12 years, we had specific restaurants where we were ordering food from. So all of that is on the map. So I would say some kind of curation, a personal story behind a map always helps, always makes it more fun and interesting. That's where we start from. And about the process of making the map, it's like I said that we thought we knew a lot, and then we started researching, and we got to know so many things about the place. We spent about 3 months just visiting these different, historical looking buildings and temples and you name it. We went into each of these. I have a team of designers, illustrators, and I had an intern who was helping me at the time. All of us together were behind this research. Midway, we approached Alisha Sadikot because she does a lot of Baikala walks, and we wanted her perspective on, what she sees in this area. And she gave her inputs, which, added even more to what we already had. And then we reached out to this chef, Siddharth Sumaya. He curated a list of eateries of the place for us. All of these people have something to do with the area, so they know something that Google Maps may not tell you. So if you read through the maps, you might find some interesting anecdotes like, there's an old village, right? There used to be an old village right behind my studio. Used to be as in the village is still there, my studio isn't. But so that village was something that I've not experienced. Yeah, Bandra has those kind of houses, yes. But this is something that people don't know of. So it's untouched. There are no stores. There's nothing. There are just old people living in old bungalows. And it's beautiful. It's calming. The moment you enter the space, there's a different vibe to that place. And nobody told us when we were even looking for a space there,
Absolutely. And I think we'll discuss this in the map as an archive.
Okay, cool. All
point
right.
I want to bring up after this.
Okay, I'll talk then.
How do you approach the process of making the many wonderful maps that you have created? What is the main thing, the first thing that kind of starts off a particular thematic map for you?
The elevator pitch. So we will start with saying, okay, we want to do a map on Bombay when it was becoming Bombay, right? Building Bombay, for example. And we came up with, I think, a long list of 60 places, 60 buildings we thought were interesting. So in a team of 5, we did a huge amount of reading. We went on heritage walks. We roamed around the city. We took photographs, and we came up with this list of 60 places. Again, this is from a designer's point of view, not necessarily an architect's point of view. And then we looked for the story that connected them. I mean, we didn't start with saying that we're going to call it Building Bombay. So sometimes the name does sort of lend itself. We have been known to come up with a name first and then do the rest of it because it gives us the story. What is the story that we would like you to, go home with at the end of this map? So we put a lot of effort into the research, into writing the map, into choosing the facts and the perspectives that we will share for every single site. They all connect up. So that story, and that's why we call it Story City, that story is critical. And we should be able to sum it up in a couple of sentences. And if we can do that, then that justifies why something comes on the map or not. So in just it is a sort of design thinking breakdown of our process, but what is the story? What is that 2-line elevator pitch that justifies why we are going to publish this? Keep in mind, we self-publish. So we have to be able to justify our effort and energy and the cost of publishing and bringing it to an audience. So we actually approach it as we would a client project. We do the groundwork, we write ourselves the brief, and then we take it from there.
Thank you. I'm always amazed, like you were saying, the idea of maps and the intention of a communication intention of a map is storytelling also. Apart from, of course, mapping for purposes of administration, mapping for purposes of military, that aside. And it's really nice for me personally also to see the kind of popular imagination that maps are able to capture. I don't know if there are any Game of Thrones fans in the audience, but the opening sequence of those maps, it's incredible how much of plot point connections and storytelling connections you get in that first 2 minutes of introduction, even if you skip the episodes. It's absolutely amazing. So while you use maps...
Ruta, that also comes from Tolkien's, J.R.R. Tolkien's
yes, absolutely.
writing of the Lord of the Rings, right?
That's where it started.
He mapped out the geography of Middle Earth, as he was planning those books. So I mean, there is a practice, I think, as a writer, as a creator of cartography, of discovering and marking the lay of the land that you are going to take that journey on.
Absolutely. And at this period, we are looking at 18th, 19th century, that the maps of that period that really inspired the Tolkien universe and thereby the George Martin universe of things. And it's exciting, as Asad was saying in his introduction, that maps open up a worldview, a way of thinking, a way of design thinking as well. Which brings me to my next question. We'll continue with you and then we'll switch to Mrinal. What were some of the unique challenges you faced while developing the story within your maps?
Editing. We want to tell you everything, but we can't.
Choosing what needs to be said.
I mean, our Story City maps are, we set the constraints first. So they have to be printed on A3 size paper, front and back. That is our constraint. So we have to be able to fit everything we want to say on that one sheet of paper. So I think map making of any kind is an incredible exercise in storytelling, yes, but also in editing, in information design, and in pure typography, because the language has to communicate at such a small size with great efficacy, in all kinds of lighting conditions, in all kinds of ergonomic conditions. I mean, someone could be reading your map out in broad daylight, and you have to make sure that the type and the color and the paper are all conducive to that exercise. So it's a very practical constraint as well. And I mean, there's a reason why each of these maps would have been printed at a particular size. There are so many constraints that come into the picture.
Would you like to add about the challenges and constraints? So his question, I'm going to segue into something else. So let's catch your thoughts first.
As Ruchika said, I think editing took I don't know how long. It was, because I'll give you some context. Basically, we started working on the map in 2019. We were almost done by Feb 2020, and then pandemic happened. And the joke is, it was a lot of work put in till then. Pandemic happened, lots of things changed, and our studio was no more there. Lots of things that were there pre-pandemic and what we had written for, all of that was gone. There was Baikla restaurant gone. So coming back, the whole exercise had to be done again. So that took a lot of time. Other challenges we had was because Baikla is, a place where you will find people from lots of religions, lots of religious places, lots of cuisines. That's a great part. And all of these different buildings, I'm calling them buildings, they are all religious buildings. It was a task to get through to them, tell them why we are here, what we want to do. It was a task to explain to them every now and then. The funny thing is, there's a Chinese temple in Muscat. That was the easiest to get through and to talk to. But yeah, we face those kind of issues as well.
Thank you. To Mrinal, my question is, we see the way maps evolved from the surveys that we see here to a very sort of fun take on maps by 1930s, 1940s. Especially I've seen some of the Joshi maps which have these colorful vignettes of the must-see sites of Bombay back then. So as a collector or as somebody who's been avidly looking at older maps, what are the key points you think that would distinguish for the kind of maps that are intended for serious consumption or serious official purposes to something which has to be consumed by tourists? When did that shift you see, do you notice happening in the maps you have?
So I think in this space, very early on, we'll go back a little bit before the 1920s and 30s. A lot of the British tourist maps start coming up around the 1870s. So what had happened by then is, again, once taking a bit more of the overall evolution, once you have a colony, there was a colony by then, but once you have stability in the region, you want to sort of, and you've colonized it, you just want to sort of, make whatever you can out of it, in whatever aspect. It's also spreading the whole concept of the way the crown is seen at the time. So there was this whole pitch where the crown had taken over from the company, and you have again officials or whatever, I guess map makers and publishers in this case, pitching the concept of India, and in this specific case here, Bombay as a tourist destination. So you see such maps come out, and even going into the pre-independence era and the post-independence era. In terms of from a collector's perspective, of course, the first thing one looks for is rarity. What also happens beyond the rarity is, and the quality, that the condition it's in. But beyond that, what happens is, once one begins or is able to begin to decontextualize a lot of this, you can see a lot of, let's say, the kitsch factors, what we would call today, in terms of, again, maps then, if they were made locally and distributed locally for whether for, international tourists or local tourists, they were throwaways. It's like today, if I get, if I get a text, I'm not going to keep it or save it again. It's analogized perfectly. But you know what I mean? It's something that doesn't stay with you for too long. It's just very normal and natural to have around. So the quality of printing was very low for a lot of these maps. So, and sometimes you see like the color overlay is slightly off the actual delineation of the lines. So things like that. But in terms of serious collectors, what eventually a serious collector does look for and is of most interest is marginalia. So marginalia, again, is a technical term, but basically what it means is what's written on the map, on the sides of the map, someone who used it. Sometimes they write their name, sometimes they sign it, sometimes they write, okay, I'm going here next. They list out their whole travel itinerary, and, to try and get a sense of, what this person was up to. Sometimes you just end up coming into, bits where someone important or some unknown personality of the time has written on it, signed it in some aspect or the other. And typically a serious map collector, if they have an item of this sort, they would display it with glass, so there'd be glass front and back through which you can see, so again, it's little bits that eventually serious collectors look for. But in general, for collectors, it's more of, decontextualizing it into artwork. Again, that's the subject that we're at today, because today that's what most of these maps really are. They are works of art for us because they don't hold the same context that they did in that time.
Thank you. One thing I really love about maps is what they don't tell. And I just want to read out one quote from this really nice book, How to Lie with Maps, by Mock Monmonier, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He says, there is no escape from the cartographic paradox. To present a useful and truthful picture, an accurate map must tell white lies. And that's interesting because we see in many maps, none of them can be true beyond a certain point. There is a fine line between the map maker, a wide gap, I would say, between the map maker and the map reader. Who is presented and who is not presented. In one of the first maps here, I think a newspaper did an article that you see the map of Kamatipura, but certain areas of brothels are absolutely not represented on it. So who makes the map? What do they intentionally leave out? What is represented is one of the very interesting processes of map making. How did you come to the conclusion, apart from the editing perspective, to what to really represent in the maps? Because there are a lot of design elements you have to use to represent certain things. Anything you would like to put in perspective?
So because on average, one of our maps has about 25 locations marked on it. We tend to illustrate the most obvious landmarks. So if you were navigating the space on foot, you would be able to see, so on the Art Deco map, you would be able to see Suna Mahal, or you would be able to see Regal Cinema. You would be able to come to certain crossroads and see certain landmarks and orient yourself. So that is one. What are the points of spatial reference? The other decisions for us tend to be stylistic decisions rather than information decisions, because every map, because it has a theme, we want that map to also convey that theme or the spirit of that theme in the way that it is designed. So it is a visual exercise as well. So we maintain a very, very high quality of production on all of our maps. We do not want you to throw it away. In an age when you could be accessing a map for free on Google Maps, why would you keep a Story City map? Because it is well made, because it is well designed. So the deco map, for example, we get down really to the nitty-gritties of the illustrations are designed to reflect deco illustration style. The typography, some of which was hand lettered, is inspired by buildings such as by the signage of buildings on the oval. The typography, which constitutes a body text of the map, is inspired by the lettering of Richard Neutra, who was an American architect working in the 30s and 40s. So it's inspired by the lettering that he would use on buildings and in his architectural drawings. The colors of the map, where we use a pale pink and almost a pista green, is inspired by the colors of Deco era buildings, because the buildings were painted in pale yellow and pale pink and pale green and sort of almost ice cream colors in a way, you know. So the map also has those same colors on it. So we bring in whatever it is that we are addressing, we bring in those aspects. The City of the Sea map is painted entirely in watercolor, entirely in blue. It's a completely hand-drawn and hand-painted map, because it is a story map. It's a very imaginative map in a sense. If you try to use it to actually get from place A to place B, you may not be able to do that, but it would take you on a journey of another kind. So depending on the purpose of the map, we kind of design them to reflect the sort of arc of the narrative that the whole map, the whole publication holds within it.
I think, like you both already said, the purpose of the map, the intention with which each map is created, that tells a story. It tells one person's or one section of society's story, maybe not all. Similarly, our intention, I'll tell you about this map, was mainly to have people engage with the area. We were looking at why would a person engage with an area, right? Food, would like to see something, would like to go to a museum. There is a zoo, there's a botanical garden. So all of these pointers is what informed the map that we worked on. Obviously, there are lot many things in Mazgaon Baikala which are not on the map. For a simple thing is like the GST Bhavan is there. It's a massive building, a government building. It's drawn in the map, but it's not, picked out or marked out, because we don't want everyone to just land up inside that building, right? So these kind of decisions also, inform what goes on the map and what truths do we tell.
Correct.
I also think that the Because Baikala map is in itself a reason to go to Baikala. Okay, Baikala is not an obvious destination. If you come to Mumbai and you're visiting the city, it's not
I feel that in my bones.
Yeah, it's not on your top 5, right? Like, you want to go to Bandra, you don't want to go to Baikala. But the map, you see the map and you say, okay, yeah, I can spend a whole day in Baikala. Let's do that. That's a reason to go there. And I think that's a really, like she said, it's a way to engage with the place, but it's also a reason to engage with the place that you wouldn't think of otherwise. If it's mapped out, if someone gives you this list of, hey, we're really cool people and we have this really awesome list, like, you go there. And and I think like the tourism department should be like commissioning more of these maps for Ghatkopar. Why don't we have a map of Ghatkopar? Yeah.
And what you said about Baikala is so true, because the museum is located in Baikala, and so many people have asked us, oh, we would come if it was in Fort. And we have to always say that, okay, there is a Fort museum, it's amazing, it's huge, it's beautiful. But did you know that Baikala was the Malabar Hill address kind of pull in the 19th century? And that's what you see on the map. Fort area is literally a fort. It is not, how do I say this delicately? It's not somewhere where the gentry or the well-to-do want to be seen at. We actually have letters dating 1850s where the then curator is offered the space in Fort, saying that there is already a plan to expand Fort. And he actually says, we don't want everybody to be able to access the museum. Hence, the museum will be in Baikala, which was next to the government house, next to the house of back then one of the richest man in Asia, David Sassoon. And all these stories are fun to see on the map. Also, because Baikala map really touched all of us at the BDL for this reason. Because Baikala Bakery was our go-to space for those early morning breakfasts where we had to show up before the museum opened to set up for workshops and so on and so forth. And the owner knew all our life stories. He knew what was happening in our personal lives because he chatted with us every morning when we went for a bun maska. And of course, their pumpkin sauce. And when it just immediately, when COVID hit, the first thing to go was that to be replaced by a Burger King. And we still, it really hurts when we still talk about it because it was such a personal connection. And then we saw the Because Baikala, and we have been thankfully documenting a lot of oral histories of the communities in Baikala. And we are lucky we have a lot of footage, video, and images of Baikala Bakery in our archives today. But it's interesting that when you do map neighborhoods like these, which are fast eroding, shifting, as time goes on, things change, especially in a fast-paced, shape-shifting city like Mumbai. But it's amazing for me to see how maps act as an archive of the community, because it's not the geographical borders only that make up the culture. It is the people.
Mark in time. So,
yes.
In 2023, this is what there was in Baikala. Maybe it's not going to be there in 2025.
Absolutely.
I'll have to make another edition of the map. But yeah, that's
Absolutely.
a very interesting part. And I think it's great to document history, if
Yes.
I may say so.
Yeah, and there's so many precincts. I'll work in one precinct and I live in another heritage precinct of Kotachiwari. So we really like to see these kind of maps. Recently, when the fake news broke out that they're going to pull down Eros, first thing I did was think about your map. I was like, oh my God, it's so great that she did this when she did. Of course, thankfully it was fake news because it was unbelievable that a UNESCO heritage site would meet that fate. But it's important, and we see so many historic things documented in these maps that are also, in a way, supported by the community you work with. And would you like to touch upon the community experiences, the community response to your maps before I take in Mrinal's points of view?
I think for us, the greatest reward is when visitor to Mumbai comes, picks up one of our maps, and then writes to us and says, I would not have, gone to this part of the city had it not been for your map, because there are no guidebooks as such, and the only material online tends to be features in magazines and editorial features. The great fun is when a long-time Mumbaiker says, I did not know that about Nala Supara, or I went and discovered that in Bandra. And like Robert Stevens, for example, we had just released City by the Sea, and he said, I didn't know that Nala Supara used to be a port. And so the second series of photographs, aerial photographs of Mumbai that he did were around the Nala Supara region to see how that had changed. And that had come from the City by the Sea map. So it was amazing that, among these sort of heritage enthusiasts, because I think we're just enthusiasts, it's a great fun hobby, that we keep swapping notes and information. Oh, did you know that building is an Art Deco building? Or do you know this was the name of that building? So for us, I think it's an exercise in curiosity. It's a way of remembering a place together. It's a way of discovering a place together. And that's the greatest reward. is being able to see a place anew. You know, there is a T.S. Eliot quote where he says that our journey will be to return to the place and to know it for the first time, and that's what we do that's what we hope to do. I did not know, for example, having lived in the city for about 20 years, why Fort was called Fort until I did the first map. So it's a way for me it's a very selfish exercise for me and the team to also learn about the city that we live in. And that's all it is. That's what it means for us as a community of heritage lovers.
One of the maps on display here brought to mind, it's back there, it's called, I think it's the map of the Gulf of Cambay. And I think that was the one that really inspired this artist group called CAMP. They created a map that was commissioned by the museum in 2014-15 called Country by the Sea. And we are so used to seeing the sea at the side of the land, encompassing the land on maps. Even in sea charts, you have land somewhere before you have the expanse of the sea across the map. What they did was they inverted, and you see that in this map as well. The sea takes the center stage. The sea is the land. What borders are towns along the coastal route, in this case the Western Ocean, the Arabic Ocean, that is mapped out with all the towns including Mumbai, Cambay, Basra, ports in Somalia, and these are all on the fringes. And the exercise in map was to talk also about the seafaring and sea trading communities, and it was displayed along with a documentary they had created. So it was a community engagement exercise, and it was interesting for us to see people of Mumbai who are so used to and who have a relationship with the sea, the Koli fishermen, who we have a very dedicated audience who come to the museum because of the zoo, who come from communities like this, that they look at these maps and they see the representation of their lifestyle, their perspective of the city showcased in this map. I wanted to ask you, Mrunal, through your workshops, through the talks you have done using your collection of maps, has there been any particular instance of such evoking such memories among people, or somebody who has come up to you and said, okay, I remember this was like this, and you don't see that anymore, or they gave you a different story of the space?
So not precisely what you're saying, but something similar, I guess, did happen. What happened is it was a talk I did for one of the Rotaries in town, and it was some recent, I wouldn't say research, but it's some recent anecdotes that I'd unearthed from the Bombay Gazetteer, where, I tried to put that together with some of what some maps show, some contemporary accounts that have been written, and again, going back to older accounts, which are slowly coming in, I guess they're being unearthed and coming into the light. So the whole subject was how the name Mumbai comes from the land itself, and it's not something that the Portuguese came up with, and it's not something that the British came up with, which they converted from, at least they say, from Mumbai to Bombay, from Bombay to Bombay to Bombay, and then, Mumbai, they say, is derived from Bombay, whereas it's not true. Mumbai actually was the original, the name that belonged to this land itself. So when I spoke about that, there was a projectionist at that talk, and he said that, he started almost tearing up, saying that, it's their community, the Koli community, that, originally had these lands, and it brought back all these memories, and it's great that research is being done, and it's, such things are being put forth. So again, it's that sense of belonging, because, again, we can say that there are, certain stances that have taken precedence, and, a lot of the, let's say, more true accounts have been pushed aside, and, when someone encounters this through some sort of research and through some sort of fact checking, it makes all that difference. So that was something that I encountered.
We were speaking before this talk happened on a Zoom call, and that's where we were talking about typography in maps, what you also just spoke about. And you actually mentioned that there were set types that were to be used on older maps. Anything you would like to add on that? And at the same time, how do you ensure, as artists, as creators, as designers, what is your one cardinal rule to ensure your maps are accessible to the, I wouldn't say target demographic, but to the larger audience?
I'll talk about making it more accessible. So while we were designing this map, we wanted people to come to this area that we're talking about. But the biggest challenge was, after making a map, how do you put it out? Who gets this map? That was the biggest challenge. We had, we've been self-publishing for quite some time now. And trust me, there's no profit, there's no place to store stuff. With this map, we wanted to make sure that it goes big, it reaches people, and it's not something, like, I would love it if, all maps are free, sorry, but just to make it more accessible with this idea in mind that people come to this area. And to make that happen, we were very lucky, even though our studio was not in Mazgaon post-pandemic. We got in touch with people who were from Baikala, people who had businesses there, like Sabko Coffee, Bombay Sweet Shop, the museum. There's a Jack Printers. All of these people, we spoke to them, we showed them what we had. And I would call them locals of Baikala, Mazgaon now. They were the people who made sure that this reaches a bigger audience. So I think it is very important, if there's a map made for mass appeal, there needs to be mass involved. It doesn't happen with one person. There needs to be community. Only then something like this can be pulled off. So yeah, I think that was...
I think our Story City maps have shown that it is possible to communicate through maps as a medium. And it is because of that we have been commissioned to create so many more maps for so many different audiences. So one of the most important things the city had for, I think, 6-7 years was the Mumbai art map, which was a free map that was distributed across 60 locations across the city every quarter. And when they came to us to redesign the map, we designed it to be more cost efficient, more efficient on paper, more efficient on ink, more ergonomic, as a result of which they were able to pull in more advertising, they were able to subsidize the map, and it was distributed completely for free. So I think in terms of accessibility, as Zeenat said, there needs to be a community involvement and stakeholdership for maps to reach more people. Yes, of course, we have Google Maps, but is Google Maps going to tell you where the latest exhibition is on in town? It doesn't. Nobody does that. Nobody puts that effort into actually curating that and collating that information on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis. So I think, and it changes, I think we like our phones in India, but people that visit the city, that visit the country, don't necessarily use their smartphones the way that we do. It still is a physical object, and you still mark something up physically on a map. Accessibility-wise, we have made efforts to publish in multiple languages, so some of our maps have been privately commissioned and translated into Hindi and Marathi as well. We've changed the language to appeal to school students between the ages of 8 and 15. And those have all been based on existing drawings and existing designs. They've been commissioned for different audiences. So we also keep in mind, because we work so much in the culture sector, we work in mind that we should be able to publish this in any given language, any language at any point in time. We're often called upon to publish the same map in 2 languages. So for example, for Kochi Biennale, we've done the same version in English and in Malayalam. Of course, these are all design challenges, I think. And that's what we're here for.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come back to this thing about how can public participation be ensured in certain maps. Before we go into that, I want to check and ask you about your favorite elements when it comes to these amazing cartouches that you see in the maps, the typography, the lettering, what is that one thing that always stands out for you in terms of maps, whether they are contemporary, just slightly older, or really historic maps?
For me, with the older sea charts, I mean, whether they were printed or manuscripts, what really stands out is this. It's the cartouches in which you have the lettering to keep it simple. And the compass roses, those are always beautifully done. And again, since we are in this space of, art and cartography, a lot of these maps were made in an artistic way for a very long time, especially when they were the sea charts. When everything moved towards the being from the perspective of land, it started becoming a little more, by the rote, and in terms of how much more can you publish and how quickly and get it out and give it to the public and such. But yeah, so it was even in its contemporary context, they were works of art. But for me personally, again, because a lot of my interest comes from the historical angle, what really stands out is, looking at a certain map, when was it published, when was it sketched, and what was really happening at the time. And there are certain times where, there are things which are shown and things which are not shown, and what are the reasons for them. So just to give you a very quick example, there's a map that I have with me from the 1750s, in which it's made by a French cartographer who was then thought to be the greatest cartographer in the world, or the best known at least. And he was the official cartographer to the French king. I think it was Louis XVI at the time. And he made this map of Bombay by being supplied information from the English East India Company, because, again, East India Company was a private enterprise, and even though they were fighting the 7-year war at the time, the English and the French, there was still that partnership, in a sense, that was ongoing. And then what you see in the map today, because it survives with us, and it was very, there were a lot of copies of that print made, because that was a famous map maker at the time. And what you see is Malabar and Kambala Hills are where Chopati is today. So it was basically wrong information that was supplied by the East India Company, and that's something that survives with us today. And we can see, and then that the reason is because there was that war that was being fought, and there was a very real possibility that they thought at the time that the French would attack Bombay from Pondicherry. And the funny thing is, once everything got under the British dominion, and a lot of these old government documents were declassified, they did end up finding out. In fact, it was George Birdwood that at the Bhavda Jilad Museum at the time, Victorian Albert Museum of Western India. They ended up finding out that there was a map of Bombay drawn in secret right around the time where the wrong information was supplied. So again, it was tying up a lot of these things. When you look at maps, and again, different maps have different facets that they show and don't show. So there's always intrigue that's possible.
Thank you. Coming back to our point about the larger public conversation and public participation about maps. Now we have applications such as like ChatGPT, the Map GPT, AI. Of course, Google Maps are inescapable and very much needed today. How would we use these kind of tools that we have at our disposal today, democratic tools to a certain extent, to engage the public, engage planners together? Because we see clearly the issues, everything is kind of dug up, everything is happening simultaneously, roads are being constructed and demolished almost simultaneously in the same area at the same time. Any ideas on how public participation, public engagement with the design of a map that is a map that would make sense of Mumbai for daily commuters, daily Mumbaikars who are going up and down, great lengths in the city to work? Any ideas on the design incorporation and the public participation on that you would love to share? Anything you've been thinking about before we go to my last question, which was wishful thinking?
I think in terms of participation from the audience, the mass, I think before reaching the maps, the smaller maps that we artists are doing, I think there needs to be a big design intervention on the wayfinding system that is existing. If you're talking about daily commuters, like she mentioned when she moved to India, that was the first thing that, grabbed her attention, that, how do you go from point A to point B? There is Google Maps. If you can afford Uber, that's fine. But if you're taking a bus and train, you still use Google Maps. But if you have these signboards adjusted to the right height, the correct color, the right font, even the right language, and information in the sense that how the sign is designed, I think that will help us a lot more. And then, I mean, secondary would be, engaging with the design that we are working on. I think the first engagement is on that level.
I think there are 2 or 3 different aspects to this. One is maps don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of larger communication systems. And what Zeenath is saying is that if you have a map, whether it's on your phone or it's a physical map on paper, how does that information translate into your physical environment? If I'm standing in front of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj terminus, is there a sign there that says that this is where I am at? If I'm standing on a particular street, is there a street sign that confirms what I see on the map? So that is one. There's that whole universe of communication around, of which a map is one part. The second point is, as you mentioned, who makes the map? Who decides what goes on the map? Do we have a way to memorialize the different names of a place? Instead of simply renaming a street, can we acknowledge that that street had several other names before it, even names that are not official names, but that there are other names of that street or that area or that or a particular landmark or a store that was once there that does not exist anymore. So that comes down partially to creating those making those memories manifest physically, but also keeping those oral histories alive. And again, it becomes the map. Can a map, and this is a question I ask you, can a map become a palimpsest of different times and spaces and people and memories and community? Is that possible? I think in a very 3D hologramic way, it is now technologically possible. I think in ways that we have not imagined it. I can see myself peeling away layers year by year, perhaps, of a place. And it would be really exciting to do that for one particular neighborhood or one street and see how that can happen. And I think the third question comes down to access. Who has access to maps? When the development plan for 2030 was made public some years ago, there was a huge effort by community-based organizations like the UDRI to make that development plan publicly accessible so that the public could then come forward and verify, yes, this is a park, but this has been shown as something else. This is an open space, but it has been shown as being built up. Here is a photograph of it today as it stands. This is an open space, but the DP shows that it's covered up. So that relates to civil society, that relates to civil participation. Are we enabled and empowered as citizens of the city today to access those maps, make our sort of recommendations, make our judgments, fight our battles on the basis of those maps? And there are people here that have advocated for the city who will be able to tell you greater stories, more significant stories. There's a battle we're fighting in our ward at the moment over Patwardhan Park being converted into, in H Ward West being converted into a parking lot. But we know that there are 400 parking spaces that are not being used at the moment around that area, and we don't actually need to convert it into a parking lot. But who has access? It comes down to that question, who has access to the map? And who is empowered to use that map as a tool? So I think there are several issues, there are several histories and future histories at stake here, future possibilities that are at stake when it comes to the larger communication systems, ways of memory making and access. And all of these three pertain to the relevance of maps in our lives. Otherwise, they're souvenirs. Otherwise, they're just souvenirs. But if we can empower these three aspects, I think that they become real tools and real weapons in the hands of citizens.
Yeah, I think you really put that and summed up that argument very precisely on that. One thing that reminded me, on my way here, I saw these outside the railway headquarters, opposite Churchgate Station. I saw these My Bikes parked, which is a system of deposit a bike and take it for short distances. I don't remember seeing any indication at Churchgate Station saying there is a bike service outside. A lot of our stations don't have the basic indications that, okay, you have come to Bhaikala, there is a museum and a zoo, 2 minutes walking outside the station. I remember my first time, many years ago, I wanted to go to the museum when it just reopened. I got off at Bhaikala station. I took actually a cab to go to the museum, which is like 2 minutes away. This is before Google Maps was easily accessible on phone, in my defense. But like I said, I'm directionally challenged, and of course the taxi driver was not going to say no to a 10 rupee fare. But there was no indication that within 5 minutes I could actually access the museum, and I was just wandering about the city, trying to figure out how do I get there. Which brings me to the point that older maps had very different ways of putting, understanding spatial areas. And in many early Roman Greek maps, it was the religious centers that was the center of the map, and then the whole world was around that perspective. We have interesting perspective even in Indian miniatures, where certain areas, I recently saw an online presentation of this beautiful exhibition that's happening at Smithsonian of the miniature paintings from Udaipur, and the curators actually overlaid the miniatures and a map, present-day map of Udaipur, to talk about spatial understanding in miniatures. If you could create a map, a wishful map of Mumbai, with putting something that's iconic Mumbai in the center, what would you put? It can be food, it can be heritage sites, it can be anything. What would you put and create a map? And that question is open to all three of you. Do you want to start?
Sure. For me, a lot of this, as you've probably noticed, it goes back to history and the historical context. So again, for me, a wishful thinking map would be a map of 7 islands or whatever. Maybe it was 4 islands. That may be a whole another long discussion if we get into how many original islands Bombay was. But what I would really put at the center, because again, when we talk about maps today, all we're talking about is the European-centric view of the world and European-centric view of maps of this part of the world specifically. Because again, there is a whole other discipline and side to Indian map making, which again, Bombay somehow did not encounter. There are many visual records of pre-Portuguese era, but there's no visual maps that really exist. So where I would put this visual map in terms of what would be the center of it would be, for me, Bombay Castle. Because again, it's literally just a couple of 100 meters just behind us on this side, and that's literally the first ever European structure that was built on these islands, and that's where the whole whatever we say now, the history is what is. It's already all happened now. But what I try and think of is if Bombay had not gone over from the Portuguese to the British, what would have really happened here? Sometimes something I think about, would the Marathas have been one of the prominent powers? Because they really were one of the prominent powers in that at that early time where Shivaji was, kind of conquering different areas around. So what would have really happened? The only thing I think of then when I come back to the contemporary context is, if we had 7 islands and we had to navigate all these coastal roads and sea links all over again, we'd drive ourselves insane. So, I'm so glad that, it's not. But again, that's my wishful thinking. Because again, this for me, this space comes from a place and time. So yeah, the 7 islands is what I would go for.
Thank you.
I would put VT station, CSMT at the center, because I still think that when I first left home to come to college in town, it really was the train system and the train network that helped me orient myself to the city. So I would put VT station at the center. Because for many of us, everything is, for so many Mumbaikars, everything is about those 2 points on the train where you get in and get off. Your market, your bank, your school, your work, your home, everything is oriented along those lines and those axes. Yeah.
I would love a map of Bombay that is revolving only around public spaces, which means the smallest of gardens in every single area. I lived in Prabhadevi for about 7 or 8 years, and trust me, it was a task. There were no parks, there was nothing around. There was just this one park which was closed half the time. So I think that struggle really makes me want to see a map that talks about the smaller green areas where you can just go for a walk. Like, I know the national park is right there, but I can't go for a walk to national park every day. So, that I would love a map that revolves around these public spaces.
Thank you. I think it's been a very fun discussion, and I hope all of you really enjoyed the many different layers we spoke about in terms of the art of cartography.
Thank you so much. Just what a thought-provoking discussion. I remember you just made this comment about the metro and the train station. I'm putting my opera house hat on, and when we looked at theatres and successful theatres in Bombay in the past, they were all next to a train station. It's lovely to see all these young kids in the room, and this guy was sketching a brilliant map as we were sitting. And my 15-year-old niece, a couple of years ago, I asked her, what do you want for a birthday? She said, I want a map framed. I'm like, really? Next year it was a guitar, but that was good. But thank you so much, Mrinal, Ruchita, and Zeenath and Rutha for such a wonderful moderation. To our partners, Asiatic Society of Mumbai, Rotary Club of Bombay, the Tata Group, Past Perfect Heritage, for partnering with us, but most of all to this audience for coming here in such numbers and actually braving this heat. More power to you guys. But thank you. At Avid, we have many programs lined up. Our next one is on the 12th of May, which is on Friday. It's the Sound of Code, an immersive live coding and music performance. It's at a gallery down the road called XXL at Cuff Parade. And following which, we spoke about AI briefly, but we're doing lots of stuff in that space. Everybody's hating it at the moment, I know. But artificial intelligence is the future of tech art, and that's at the NGMA on the 25th of May. To find out more about our program, just stalk us on social media or check out our website. Thank you very much for coming here once again, and have a wonderful evening.